Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Uh, a very good afternoon once again, and welcome back to the last session of today's day 5. Uh, Today we have a lecture by the our convener, Dr. Arun Vishwanathan. He will be presenting on nuclear weapons and national security. So let me introduce our convener and our guest speaker, Dr. Arun Vishwanathan. Dr. Arun Vishwanathan is currently Associate Professor in Security Studies in Center for Security Studies, School of National Security Studies, Central University of Gujarat. He has earlier been Assistant Professor at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Savitribai Phule, Pune University, and at the International Studies and the Security Studies program. And he also worked in the National Institute of Advanced Studies, NIAS, Bangalore. Dr. Arun has also been Assistant Director in the National Security Council Secretariat, and he has also worked as an Associate Fellow at the India Phagwa Society, IDSA campus, New Delhi. Dr. Arun is the co-editor of the book Troubling Tehran, Reflection on Geopolitics, and he also co-author of the monograph NSR, Pakistan Tactical Nuclear Weapons, Implication for Indo-Pak Deterrence. Sorry. So his research has been published in the Strategic Analysis, USI Journals, Contemporary Review of the Middle East, International Journal of the South Asian Studies, Synergy Journals, a journal of the Center for Joint Warfare Studies, in addition to the opinion pieces in the various national and international media houses. So I welcome you, sir, and I hope all participants will have able to learn many things about the nuclear and its national securities. And and welcome you once more. And over to you, sir, Arun, sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for that very kind and generous introduction. I hope, given the nature of the participants, that we have people from all different disciplines of teachers, I thought that I will start with the very basics of nuclear fissile material, then go on to explaining little bit on the fuel cycle, because directly jumping to nuclear weapons, for me, I thought it was not a very good idea, because one has to also realize the associated dangers. And because nuclear energy, nuclear power is a twin-sided, you have dangers both at the back end of the fuel cycle and the front end also. And secondly, nuclear power brings its own challenges, its own threats. Secondly, I also wanted to go on and talk about something which is very not very frequently talked about, which is about the effects of nuclear weapons. We know that nuclear weapons and deterrence, and all of us have studied it, and mutually assured deterrence or MAD is a very common household kind of a terminology. But what makes a nuclear weapon so very different and so very destructive is something that one needs to keep reiterating, especially for all of us who study this as a subject, and for the community at large. The third thing that I will end my presentation with is a few basic concepts, and there I hope that that will actually initiate some discussion today. So just bear with me till I share this slide. Please do let me know once it is visible to you.
Is visible.
It's visible.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with a very brief timeline of uranium, which was discovered in 1979. And for over 100 years, it was used mainly as a colorant. We did not know of the kind of uses that we are doing it today for generating nuclear power, or for making nuclear weapons, or for X-rays, various other lab-based experiments. So that part of uranium or radioactivity was not very clearly known. It was only in 1898 when Marie Curie discovered radium, and then you have this usage which started in cancer therapy, but largely uranium as it was generally dumped still as waste. And this continued till about 1939 when nuclear fission was discovered, and the first controlled chain reaction came up on December 2nd, 1942. Subsequently, 3 years later, we had the first successful test in Nevada desert, the Trinity test as it was called, under the Manhattan Project, and we have the 6th and 9th first nuclear bombs being dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The second part of the presentation, in the next few slides, I thought we will take you through the mining, milling, and the fuel cycle part of the nuclear weapons, because this is more of also a overall introductory presentation to nuclear weapons and nuclear milling and mining. If you see why the nuclear suppliers group is so very effective, and why we have been trying to be part of it. And after the nuclear deal, there was an exception which was made to India at the behest of the United States. But the nuclear suppliers group as an export control regime is very effective, is because of this fact, which I highlight in the second bullet, that 50% of the world's production comes from just about 10 mines in 6 countries. So the number of mines which are producing this nuclear fissile material, especially uranium, is very limited. So if a few number of countries get together as a cartel, that cartel will be actually very effective. The mining takes place by 4 methods, as I mentioned here. This on the background you can see the picture, which is essentially an open pit kind of a mining which is taking place. And then you have underground mining, where uranium is deep underground, so you have to go through tunnels. Some is in sandstone deposits, where in situ leaching is done. A lot of water is used, and there is a lot of pollution which happens in this kind of a thing. And the fourth is where uranium occurs with other minerals like gold, copper, phosphate. So it's largely a byproduct. But the fact that uranium mines are operated only in about 20 countries, with 50% of the world production coming from just 6 countries, is itself a testament to the fact as to why the nuclear suppliers group is so effective. This graph again highlights that point, that you can see one country, Kazakhstan, is producing about 40% of uranium production in the world. Followed by Canada, and then 2 countries in Africa producing about 12%. So that itself is a large number percentage. So if these 3 countries get together with Australia, you have in a sense controlled the uranium production and supply across the world. And that is why the nuclear deal was becoming so important for India. If you remember, just before the agreement was signed, July 2005 agreement was actually signed, the joint statement between George Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Most of our nuclear reactors at that time, I am saying about power reactors, were operating at very low capacity. And many of them had to be shut down because many of the mines which were there, which we were anticipating in Meghalaya, in Andhra Pradesh, many of these places were not coming online because of local opposition to these mines. Because obviously it is very risky, and also a lot of pollution happens, and people are genuinely afraid to have these mines in their backyard. So that kind of opposition, many of our mines which we were projecting were not coming online, and because of full scope safeguards, we were not receiving, as we were not part of the NSG, we were not getting this uranium fissile material. And so that being said, I'll take you through some of the whole fuel cycle. The first thing, if you see here, this is the nuclear fuel cycle, and if we start from here, this is the place where you mine, then you are milling the entire facility, converting them into this kind of uranium fuel cake, enriching them further, that is your 238 uranium 238, you are increasing. Fabrication essentially means you have these rods kind of things which are made, which are inserted into nuclear reactors. So you need to have those kind of the uranium needs to be packed in that shape, which can be inserted into nuclear reactors as packs. Then either from a power plant you have generation of electricity, or at the other hand you have spent fuel storage. After it is used, it goes into spent fuel storage. The third place where it can go is into reprocessing, which also I will talk about in some time. So going back to the earlier milling, milling is essentially you are separating, you are using leaching or separating to get to a place where you have this uranium oxide or yellow cake as it is known, which approximately has about 85% of uranium by weight. And this is done by several kind of methods, by use of leaching using oxygen and water. So there are many of these kind of processes which are taken place, but essentially what you are trying to do is that you are trying to have concentrate uranium oxide concentrate to get yellow cake. Enrichment, the raw material which is found in nature, nuclear power plants or nuclear weapons cannot use them. So what one needs to do is to increase the enrichment capacity of U-38. So your natural uranium, as this slide shows, has only about 0.7% of uranium-235. The remaining 99.3% is uranium-238. And both of them are chemically identical. What happens is the difference in mass, and the difference in mass is what helps us in enriching them, to separate the isotopes and enriching uranium-235 and increasing the number of uranium-235 within that fissile material. And there are various methods of enrichment. Centrifuge enrichment is the picture that you are seeing in your background, where this is, if one remembers the pictures we saw in Iran, that was this gas centrifuges which were used. Then you have gaseous diffusion enrichment, laser enrichment, which is not very commercially used, very expensive to use. And there are these 4 and 5. So, but to say the centrifuge enrichment and the gaseous diffusion are the most popularly used types of enriching, which is essentially in UF6 hexafluoride, 235 items are 1% lighter, and when these cylinders go round and round at very high speeds, that actually comes up to the top because it is lighter, and then it is fed through these pipes to the next cylinder, where again it is spun at very high speeds. That is the entire process of enrichment. Now, why do we enrich? We enrich because, like I mentioned in the last thing, the natural uranium is not enough to produce enough amounts of energy, and but enrichment is used both for civilian nuclear power plants as well as to make nuclear weapons, and that is the risk therein. That is, the same technology is being used to make nuclear weapons, and the same technology is also used to generate nuclear power. So, but the level of enrichment is what differs. And if you remember the entire Iran episode, where people were worried that what will be the breakout time, that will they take 1 month, will they take 6 months, how much time will the Iranians take to develop a nuclear weapon? That was calculated on the basis of the time that the Iranians were supposed to take to enrich uranium to a weapons grade uranium, which is about 90%, 90% of enrichment. And they have a 20%, they used to have before the JCPOA 20% research reactor. And the if you see the kind of chart, you have this red line, it takes from 0 to 4 to 5%, it takes the largest amount of effort. Once you have reached about 4 to 5%, then the graph is actually plateauing here. And if you once the Iranians, people were worried that once the Iranians reach actually 20%, for them to reach about 90% of enrichment, which is highly enriched uranium, it will take them much less amount of time. And there is where the problem lied in the Iranian this thing, that if they had reached about 20% of enrichment and they had a sufficient amount of quantity of fissile material at 20% enrichment, it would have taken them far less time to reach 90% enrichment. And that was the international community's worry, which was why the joint JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iranian nuclear agreement as we know it, became very important. And how do we control it? This is actually the whole this thing of nuclear safeguards and export controls on this. So the one part of it is the export controls, that is you limit the export of these sensitive items, dual use items, through the nuclear suppliers group and other these kind of export control mechanisms. The other part of the picture is the International Atomic Energy Agency, through the NPT and through the kind of obligations that one takes, treaty obligations that members who are party to the NPT take on. The IAEA inspectors visit their countries and they verify the declarations that they are making. If I have said I have 5 power reactors and these are the other facilities, nuclear facilities that I have, am I only operating 5 power reactors? Am I hiding some other facility which I am not declaring? So that is the job of the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, which are done through nuclear safeguards. Going forward, I talked about reprocessing. Very simply speaking, it is essentially whatever waste is there, that waste can be reused, and plutonium can be actually extracted out of it, which can again be used in the power reactors, as well as through re-enrichment. It can be used for other purposes, both civilian and military purposes. So that is the spent fuel, for example, contains about 96% uranium, 1% of plutonium, and very high level waste products. Now, what do we do with the waste, enormous amount of waste which is generated out of a nuclear power plant? These, when they come out, they are highly radioactive and they are extremely hot. So what the first thing what is done is the spent fuel, that is fuel from which all the energy has been taken out and it is very hot and radioactive, that is transported and kept in a temporary storage underwater. So what the water does there is that it provides them with cooling, as well as it provides radiation shielding. So this is a temporary storage which happens, and for a few years it can be transferred to an interim storage, whether it is kept in casks or it is kept in water pools, which is wet storage or dry storage. As time passes, the heat and the radioactivity, it actually decreases, and it is estimated that after around 40 years in storage, the fuel's radioactivity will be about 1,000 times lower than when it was removed from the reactor. So one major problem or one major issue, a challenge for all these countries who are making nuclear power plants and operating nuclear power reactors is what to do with the spent fuel. And India, with its 3-stage nuclear sort of thing, has thought that we will whatever spent fuel comes out of it, we will reprocess it into plutonium, we will put them into MOX reactors, fast breeder reactors, and that was the 3-stage plan that we did, so that we can actually minimize the amount of waste that is generated and the headache of storing this waste for 4 decades, 5 decades very safely and without any kind of environmental contamination and other kind of problems. Now I will turn to the second part of my presentation, which is essentially going to look at nuclear weapons per se and the effects. So I'll start with the basics, physics, nuclear fission, fusion, and the kind of weapons which are there. And subsequently, I will also go to the effects of nuclear weapons, because I believe as teachers, as educators, as students, none of us has even seen a headline of a nuclear weapons test apart from what has happening in the past decade in DPRK or North Korea. But DPRK is an exception to the rule, that nuclear testing has largely stopped. And so in the public imagination, one does not have the sense of the enormous amount of destruction that a nuclear weapon can actually do. And that is very important to develop a public debate about this, public knowledge about this, to ensure that this prestige and power which is associated with nuclear weapons over time is reduced, and nuclear weapons, we can move towards a world without free of nuclear weapons. Very basic, most of us know this, so I am not going to spend too much of time. Neutron hits target nucleus, it split, and the splitting actually generates a lot of significant amount of energy, and it is this splitting which actually generates energy. If this energy is harnessed, you can run a nuclear power reactor. If it is a chain reaction and it continues, you have an enormous amount of energy and you have a bomb on your hands. So it is essentially a chain reaction, which if you can control it, you generate power. If you cannot control it and if you let it be like that, it becomes a weapon. And this is the first kind of a very simple crude device which was saying. Why I am saying it's a crude device, the gun type device, which was the first type of fission weapon which was tested, and is a very simple physics mechanism, physics package, and it is also very inefficient because of the fact that only about 1.4% of the highly enriched uranium is actually fissioned, and the rest of it did not. In Hiroshima, if you see the last bullet on this slide, only about 1.4% of the highly enriched uranium in Hiroshima bomb, which was the gun type, actually fissioned. And this design uses highly enriched uranium. Highly enriched uranium is uranium which is enriched up to 90 and above percentage. And there's one mass from here, it is shot into by conventional explosive, thereby creating a mass. So it is like actually a gun, a trigger firing in a gun, and you come from your explosive, this bullet goes and fires this target, and that creates this chain reaction. So essentially that is why it's called a gun type. The second type of fission weapon is a linear implosion device, and this is, you see this spherical, which has high explosive lenses all around this sphere, this perimeter of the sphere, and at the center of it you have a plutonium core. So what happens here, the physics behind it, I'll just explain in very briefly, is that all these high explosive lenses are connected to each other to a trigger mechanism, and they actually almost have to explode almost at the same time. And they have to, why it is important to the same time is so that it compresses the core, and to such an extent that an explosion creates a chain reaction. If they don't explode together, what will happen is, if they explode from here and the chain, this will not be a proper explosion, and it will be a fizzle. The first Trinity test 1945, the first Chinese test 16th October, was this kind of an implosion device which was tested. And like I mentioned here, the compression of the pit or the plutonium core here has to be uniform, and it has to be tested to avoid a premature nuclear explosion, or what is called a fizzle. So when it compresses, the fissile core is compressed to a high density, making that critical, and that criticality actually generates the blast and the explosion and the release of energy. A boosted fission device, quite similar, but you are actually boosting it by use of excuse me, deuterium, tritium gas and these kind of elements, lithium 6 and all this, to increase the efficiency of fission weapons almost 100-fold. So that is the boosted. You are boosting the explosive potential of the weapon by use of these kind of, as the fission begins, the high temperature causes fusion also, and that sort of leads to release of more energy and more efficiency of the weapon, increases the efficiency of the weapon. Last broad type of nuclear weapon device is the thermonuclear device, or what is also called as the hydrogen bomb or the H bomb. And these weapons are largely in the megaton range, that is thousands, above thousands of tons, kilotons range of weapons, very large, yield lot of destruction. And we will come to when these were tested in the later on in the presentation. I will also speak a little bit about the number of, so you here you have a fission bomb, a primary, which then leads to the secondary explosion, which release massive amount of high energy neutrons, and then allowing for massive explosive yields. One question which when one teaches or gives these kind of lectures, which always comes is, what about these dirty bombs or radiological dispersal devices? To say very simply, RDDs or dirty bombs are not nuclear weapons. Dirty bombs essentially is a mix of explosives such as dynamite or any of these kind of explosives with radioactive powder or pellets. So it is actually the explosive which is going off. It is explosive which is resulting in most of the fatalities or injuries, and that is, it is very similar to any kind of other explosive or IED which is going off. The difference is it is packed with some radioactive powder or pellets, and the panic which is generated is what is more problematic. It is unlikely to after an RDD explosion, you are not going to see any kind of radiation sickness or any kind of, and this is also pretty easier to make for any terrorist because of the fact that you don't need highly enriched uranium or uranium enriched up to 20%, 90%, 80%. Many of these are widely available, like other isotopes, radioisotopes, like cesium-137, strontium-90, cobalt-60. All these are available in any diagnostic lab, X-ray lab, X-ray facility, any good physics lab in a university. So these are available and these are easy to actually get hold of, but they will not have that kind of a damage potential which a nuclear weapon will do. So that has to be stressed, and we have to be clear about it. Like I mentioned, I would like to speak a little bit about the effects of a nuclear explosion, and I will show some pictures of this also. So the nuclear radiation is about 5 plus 10, 15% of nuclear, that is the effect. 15% of the after the effect is about nuclear radiation. Then you have 35% is the heat or the thermal radiation which is released, and 50% is the blast effect or the blast radiation. So that is how a general thumb rule is this. Depends from the type of whether it is an air burst, whether it is a ground burst, what is the kind of weather, what is the kind of geography. All this will impact to some extent this distinction, this distribution, but largely it will be same for any kind of nuclear explosion. Now, what are the effects? What are the effects of nuclear explosions? And you have, like I mentioned, you have three types of effects. You have blast, thermal, and you have nuclear radiation. The proportion varies. Another thing which I wanted to mention was this proportion varies whether they are at very high level atmosphere, their explosion which is taking place from an aeroplane. You have SAR bomba, and you have many of these kind of explosions with the United States and the Soviet Union did at various. They did it underwater, they did very high altitude test, they did on the water, they did test, obviously they did underground and on ground tests also. And it depends on very high altitude, there will be a small distinction in terms of the proportion of energy which is converted, but that is going into some more detail of it, which might not be very necessary here. Now here I want to show this nuke map, which is something which I would like to show here. Just some tools which you can use when you're teaching your courses on science, technology, or on nuclear weapons. So I'll just briefly stop this PDF slide and I will go to my Chrome. Okay. Please let me know once it is visible.
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay, thank you. So this is a website which this Alex Wallerstein, who is a physicist in the United States, who has developed. You have many other these kind of website, but essentially what you are doing is you can pre-select any particular location, and I have said Beijing, so it goes to Beijing. If you change this to say Paris, it will take you, and that will go to Paris. So let us go to maybe Beijing, and you can even select by the country. You can say any particular country name which is not there in this list. You can just type it in and it will go there. You can enter a yield, that is what is the kind of weapon you want. You want a large yield weapon, or do you want a small yield weapon? Let us go with say the Hiroshima bomb, 15 kiloton. I want to say casualties and radioactive fallout. I want an air burst, that is, it is not detonating at surface, it is detonating a few kilometers above surface. So that is the difference between air burst and surface burst. If it is a surface burst, what will happen is that it will contaminate that surface for a long period of time, 30-40 years. That area will be uninhabitable. It will you will not be able to live there, grow anything, do any agriculture, anything like that. But if you are an air burst, what will happen is that the damage will be larger. That is, more buildings will get destroyed, more people will die, or more people will actually suffer fatalities or injuries. So militarily, you need to think of what kind of targets are there and what kind of height of burst you need for what your mission is essentially. I know all this sounds very gruesome, but military planners do plan like this. So let me click detonate. I have selected the city, I have selected the yield, the Hiroshima bomb, and I am saying detonate. So this is essentially a very simple kind of a calculation it is doing, and you have in Beijing you have 1,09,000 fatalities and 3 lakh injuries. Now let me change this little boy to let's say the largest Indian tested device, 60 kiloton. So you have 1 lakh and 3.3 lakh. So this is a very rough kind of a calculation. It will differ on the basis of several things. It will differ whether secondary fires will start. So apart from the blast and apart from, like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what had happened was, because it was at the initial morning hour, what had happened was that lot of secondary fires started. People were cooking their breakfast in Hiroshima at that time. So you had stoves which were there. The stoves, because of the blast radiation, toppled over, kerosene spilled, and you have another fire, small fire in a home. So it all depends on you have today you have petrol pumps, you have piped gas, you have LPG cylinders in houses. So all these things will cause the fatalities or injuries to actually go up, because this will not take into account all those kind of issues. But to get a sense and to show students and to show others as to the devastation of a single weapon being dropped in the center of a city, you have 2.5 lakh people actually dying immediately or very immediately in any 24-hour period after the explosion. You have 2.5 lakh people dying. So that is the enormity or the effect of the nuclear weapon, which is the point that I wanted to stress. I will stop here and go back to my presentation. Is it visible?
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay, thank you. And this is again about the blast intensity, that at 1 pounds per square inch, you have window shattering and fragments hitting people, causing light injuries. At 3 psi, you have residential structures which are collapsing, serious injuries are common, and you have fatalities which may occur. So like that, at 20 psi, you have heavily built concrete buildings being demolished, and fatalities actually in that area approaching 100%. And this is again in terms of the blast effect. So the shock wave comes, and then you have another the air which follows the shock, and that creates another pressure, and it topples over a lot of things and creates a lot of more damage. And this is some images from some of the tests which were done by the United States initially in the when they were testing out. Here you have a properly structure which before the nuclear test, and at high speed cameras you are actually capturing what is the kind of damage which has been done to that structure. Like this, they had tested several things. They had tested against naval vessels, they had tested against animals were tethered to that particular location and seen what kind of damage is done to the skin or to other things, to the animal itself. So there were many these kind of different things which they were testing out in the initial periods of the nuclear testing. The second part of it is about the thermal effects, which is the intense heat or the radiation which is produced by the fireball. Like you have this explosion, you have this entire fireball which is produced, and there the radiation is a very small period of time, to a tenth of a second to several seconds, depending on the bomb yield. That if it is larger bomb, it is longer, obviously. And this intense heat which is generated, radiation of intense heat, leads to very burning of skins and lot of burn injuries, and can also start serious fires, as I mentioned. That you have dry leaves, grass, paper, offices have lots of paper in them, and you have petrol pumps, and these kind of secondary fires in cities especially can break out because of this, and that would create much more damage and much more panic. A picture from the Hiroshima, where the kimono patterns, because of the color difference in the kimono, those burn patterns are actually corresponding to the darker portions of the kimono this Japanese woman was wearing at that point in time. And this is the fireball that I was mentioning, that you have this very tenth of a second, you have this very, this is how the nuclear explosion is always popularly described, that you have a stem and then you have a fireball. That is how it is described, and this is what causes all these burns and fires and all these things in a nuclear weapon. So pretty gruesome. Many more pictures are there, but I didn't want to show all of that. But this very and the third effect is the radiation effect, which is that the very different how nuclear weapons are separated from other weapons, which are also equally destructive, which kill a lot of people. But radiation damage or radiation effects is what separates nuclear weapons, because future generations of humans, of people in that area, are also suffer from the damage, from the destruction or use of the nuclear weapon. It damages the DNA sequence, and it can produce immediate effects on the active metabolic or replication processes, and also long-term effects. You can show decades later in a particular population in that area, and effects on reproductive cells in forms of cancer. So that is the long-term effect of nuclear weapons which are there. Now moving on to, because I am running out of time also here, so we will move on to the third part of the presentation in terms of the evolution of global nuclear capabilities. And here I would like to quote what Robert Oppenheimer, one of the chief scientists behind the Manhattan Project, actually described after the first nuclear weapon was tested, that he said, "We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed, few people cried, most people were silent." And he quotes the Bhagavad Gita. Oppenheimer quotes the Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu is showing his Virat Roop, and when he is talking to Arjun on the battlefield, that he should do what he unka jo duty hai unko karna chahiye. Karmanyavadhikarasthi wala jo the entire this thing is, he is giving the this thing to Gita to Arjun, and he says in that I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And in some way or the other, Oppenheimer says that with the nuclear weapon and the nuclear advent of the nuclear age, I suppose we all thought that one way or the other. A very present and very thought-provoking statement by a very famous scientist when the nuclear age actually started, that the destruction of these weapons was so much so different from anything, because it was at one shot. It was not that you have sorties and thousands of sorties of weapons being dropped on a particular German city and completely razing the city. It was one weapon which was killing 3.5 lakh people at one go. And that is why he is talking about this, and something we should always remember when we are talking about nuclear weapons in modern age also. The number of tests, you have nuclear weapon tests by P5 countries, total of over 2047 tests have been done. Most of them have been done by the United States, over 1,000 tests by the United States, followed by Russia, followed by Britain, and then you have France, who doing about 210 tests, and then China about 45 tests. Some people say China has done 48 tests, but the generally accepted figure is 45. In percentage terms, 2% for China, 10% for France, 2% again for Britain. United States and Russia, about 85% of the nuclear weapon tests that they have done. And this is only for the P5 countries that I have pulled out the data. And I am thankful to my mentor, Professor Chandrasekhar, who I had worked with an earlier project when I was in Bangalore, because we had pulled out this data from various sources at that point in time. So I'd like to acknowledge his help also in this. Now, here I would like to just briefly talk about the types of warheads which are there. We had talked about fission test, the kind of testing which was done. So you had a fission test, you had 1945 US. Immediately, the US did not expect that the Soviet Union would follow up so quickly. So you had the 1949, you had the Soviet Union also doing its first test. Then you had 1964, the Chinese October 1964 test. Airdrop, first airdrop was in 1945. That was what they did, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 1955, USSR does its first airdrop. The BF test, or the boosted fission test, US 1951, 2 years later USSR does it. China does it in 1965, 1 year later, after its first test. Thermonuclear test, China does it 3 years after his first test, which was pretty fast for it. US did its first test in 1945 and thermonuclear test in 1952. And they never expected the USSR to follow suit so quickly, that is in 1955, which took many of in the US to actually surprise. Several other types of warheads have also been tested. I just wanted to show that also, that you have low yield tests which they have been done, that is at the sub kiloton or the 1 or 2 kiloton yield. You have US doing it in way back in 1951, China doing its first low yield test in 1982. A neutron bomb, another type of weapon which is being done, tested, which was US in 1968, China in 1988. And the last test was all in the 1990s. And that is what surprises everybody so much, that when everyone is shaken by the North Korean test, because for such a long period of time, 1996 when the French and the Chinese tested, when the CTBT was being debated, we have not had a test in this century, and it is only the North Koreans who have tested a nuclear weapon in this century. This is the estimated global nuclear warhead inventories, and when everybody talks about India and Pakistan being actually the nuclear flashpoint and all this, I just turn around and say that the United States should not preach to us, because US and Russia have 5,000 and 6,000 odd weapons between them. So they should ideally look at strengthening arms control and arms reduction measures between them. India has one of the third lowest sort of weapons in nuclear warhead inventories after North Korea and Israel. And we are not at all in that race. And Pakistan has been developing more number of warheads, Kahuta 1, 2, 3 they have been making, and trying to increase their nuclear fissile material capability maybe before the FMCT comes into play. Lastly, some concepts which many of you might already be knowing, but maybe teachers from other disciplines might not have. So I will just flag them. Deterrence is a concept very associated with nuclear weapons. It is essentially to prevent an action, and that action is the use of nuclear weapons from taking place. How do you prevent that? You say that if you use nuclear weapons against me, I am going to do the same. So that threat of destruction or threat of that pain prevents an action from country A taking that action. So that is deterrence. That is very different from another concept called compellence, which is to change an existing action. Let's say the existing action of Pakistan using terror groups, Pak-based terror groups and attacks against India. Now, how that is a more difficult problem to tackle, and that is an existing policy. So you need to change that. So that is the distinction between deterrence and compellence. No first use is that I will suffer a nuclear use against me. I will not be the first to use nuclear weapons. No first use. India and China are the only two countries who have openly declared NFU in their nuclear doctrines, and for different reasons. Initially, because of the low levels of capability, China declared NFU because it was only for deterrence and it did not want to actually build it up. They still maintain largely those kinds of things, though they qualitatively their capabilities have increased, whether it is in terms of longer range missiles or in terms of their assured retaliation which they have put in place, or the fact that they have a robust triad now in place with the submarines also coming into play. India also wanted stability vis-a-vis Pakistan, and so the NFU made sense for us because we viewed nuclear weapons only as political weapons and weapons for deterrence. Unlike Pakistan, which views nuclear weapons as a war prevention role. जब भी इंडिया से झगड़ा होता है तो पाकिस्तान बोलता है मेरे पास न्यूक्लियर वेपन है, इंटरनेशनल कम्युनिटी should come and intervene. So they are using that as a war prevention kind of a role, which we do not see nuclear weapons as. For us, that is for India, nuclear weapons are political weapons and they are not war fighting or war preventing weapons. Because when you get into that, they have chances of escalation. You have chances that you can actually have unintended consequences. Credible minimum deterrence is what our doctrine talks about, and you have credible how, that you have a triad, that you have air deliverable, sea deliverable, and land, that through missiles deliverable nuclear weapons. Political will is very important. Assured retaliation, because you are saying no first use, you have to be able to absorb a first strike against yourself and retaliate with a second strike. So that is very important. That is why we are canisterizing our weapons. We have rail, road, mobile nuclear missiles, so that it is hard for the adversary to know where you are, what you are. And minimum also has been something which has been built into our doctrine. The 2003 statement which came out of the CCS meeting, that I am not in a race. I am not in a race to build a large arsenal like the United States or like the Soviet Union. I am here to maintain deterrence, to only have a political weapon. But that does not mean that because you have these statements from the West coming in that India is in an arms race. India is not in an arms race at all. But that does not mean that we will not continue to test our missiles or develop missiles which are survivable, which will be canisterized and improve the quality of our capabilities. So I will stop there, and thank you so much for a very patient hearing. I'll be happy to take any questions which there might be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Arun. It is such a wonderful lecture, and I believe our participants have learned lots of from this, because I myself, I find it very, very interesting, new things.
Excuse me, Dr. Mohan. If you could just mute one of your equipments. There's an echo coming.
Mine is mute, just a phone call. Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, and because I come to know many things about the nuclear. What we know about the nuclear for part of the studies is like nuclear weapon, this and that. But at the very beginning, you have so detailedly tell us about the fissions and other matters. It was very wonderful, and I'm so thankful for such an insightful lecture. And I believe we had a question from our participants. So now floor is open for anyone who have want to ask the questions or some comments. Yeah, Dr. Saurabh, please go ahead. You are mute.
You are on mute. You are on mute, sir.
Okay. Wonderful presentation and a sequence of the presentation. One thing the nuclear weapons can lead us to migration and become a refugee. So its sequencing is perfect. Just a little clarification. Dr. Arun, you had a wonderful presentation. I would like to know how to avoid leaching issues, because we can store the things for 40 years. And there's a lot of research coming up in UK and in other parts that they're trying to develop things where they can put it in the pit through glass. But what is the end result? That I would like to know, just out of curiosity. And what is the India's nuclear policy in the recent times after 2008, Bharat Karnad's book, which had come, India's nuclear policy? What is our current stand? Because in today's scenario, we do not see much talk about the nuclear issues. It is basically being used, what you are saying, for the political reasons, as 3 neighboring countries have political weapons: India, Pakistan, and China. So how do you perceive it from your views on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saurabh, for those 2 very useful questions. One was about this storage. Leaching and storage. How do you prevent leaching and how do you store the spent fuel? Like you mentioned, nowadays there is a lot of research which is happening on storing them in glass pits, where you have a reinforced concrete kind of a pit which is dug deep underground, and then this is put into a glass kind of a container, because glass is inert, it will not react to any of this radioactive waste, and then it is inserted into this concrete bunker or this concrete pit, and it is topped with this concrete again. So that is what one of the things that people have been researching on, and it has also been done in several countries to ensure that this spent fuel is stored without it seeping into the ground or the groundwater, and then actually causing other kind of problems for people, whether health issues or contaminating the groundwater. So that is your first question. The second question is current Indian nuclear policy or nuclear doctrine. Our nuclear doctrine 2003 is where I would say that our nuclear doctrine was operationalized after the Cabinet Committee on Security statement which came out. Now in that, but before I go into that, I like to use your question to dwell on this a little more, because India is in a very sort of unprecedented location in the nuclear realm. Why? Because United States and Soviet Union were thousands of kilometers apart. They were fighting proxy wars with each other in other places. They were not fighting with each other, or they didn't have wars with each other. The closest they came was the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you have a situation in Southern Asia where India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars in the Kargil conflict. You have 1962, you have the India and China have fought wars. And you have currently you have border disputes also between these countries. So in that sense, we are in a situation which is already, there is a lot of tension, there is a lot of sort of incomplete information, if I might like to put it. We don't know our adversaries' intentions or what they are planning and what they are doing. So in that context, our nuclear doctrine becomes that much more important, because first of all, we have taken the policy of no first use. We have said that we are never going to be the first ones to use nuclear weapons, whether we against Pakistan or China or anybody else. The second point which we have also said is that I am not in a race to build nuclear weapons or delivery vehicles. I am going to have at a minimum level, but at a credible. I have to also ensure the credibility of my deterrence. And how that is going to come is through the submarine arm of the triad. That is, you can have missiles, you can have bombers, aircraft, but you need submarines. And this was pushed back by the Americans a lot. They said, "Aapko kyun chahiye?" Stuart Talbot and Jaswant Singh, the entire dialogue which was there, it is so expensive, you guys can't afford it. I said, but we do need it, because we need to have, we are following a policy of no first use, because हमको पहला strike absorb करना है, उसके बाद हमारे पास अपना political leadership, military leadership and weapons तीनों रहना चाहिए. Only then can we actually retaliate against whoever has used nuclear weapons. So for us, the triad was important, and that was made clear in the 2003 press release which operationalized our nuclear doctrine. I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for clarification.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other question from our participant side? Yeah, Naresh, please go ahead. Dr. Naresh, please go ahead.
Yeah. And thank you, Mohan sir. And thank you, Arun sir. Actually, very enriched presentation and covered so many important aspects. And you are, sir, well-known expert in this field, but I am actually not very much aware about so many things. But just for the curiosity, actually, you have used some online digital platform like NukeMap to estimate the casualties or injuries by using this some kind of nuclear weapons. So just for the actually, sir, curiosity, I have a my personal actually just came in my mind that is it this actually impact can be affected by some kind of natural topography of the surface, like river, mountain, or temperature or humidity, something like that, which can be actually minimize or maximize this kind of casualties or injuries. And second, sir, yeah, sir, this is the just for information, sir, for your views, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank
Arun,
you. Thank you.
Arun, there's one more question. You want to take it or you want to answer this first?
I can take one more. I'll answer both together.
Oh, okay. Hemant, please go ahead.
Yeah, so Arun, this is related to availability of data, in this context. Like the other day we were discussing about unavailability of data in the context of army and research on those aspects. So, what is the status of data in this context? Whether that is available or what kind of restrictions are there? If you can throw some light on that aspect.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, Arun, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I will take Dr. Naresh's question first. And you are very right, sir, that geography, atmospheric condition, whether it is humidity or wind pattern, all these has a very important role to play in how the nuclear fallout is dispersed. Some years ago, we were doing a project, we were doing a study for the government of India, and we had done some modeling using high power computers where we looked at different weather patterns in certain regions and how under different climatic conditions, whether it is monsoon or whether it is a dry season, how will the fallout actually spread. And one thing which is very, very clear, history also tells us this very clearly, is if you look at Nagasaki was surrounded by hills on all sides. So the explosion happened and it was concentrated largely on the city, and it created a lot of destruction because there was hills on all sides. So it was like the valley was hit hardest, and it created a lot of, so the entire blast could not go anywhere into the mountains. So geography does play a very important role, and that is precisely why the Americans chose Nagasaki, because of that particular geography of the location. So geography has a very, very important role to play. Secondly, about atmospheric conditions, that is also very correct, that depending on which kind of weather, it is the southeast monsoon or southwest monsoon, what kind of weather conditions are there at different heights, what are the atmospheric conditions. So the dispersal will also take place according to that. But in the South Asian context, given that we are so contiguous to each other, that it is not that we are hundreds or thousands of kilometers away from each other, this will be very, very limited. Matlab, you will have some fallout on both sides of the border. For example, in India and Pakistan context, it cannot be that other any conditions, everything will come to this side or go to that side. You will have fallout on both sides. So I think that the countries and the leaders also realize this, which is why we have been particularly taking this threat seriously and acted as the responsible power when it comes to nuclear weapons. I hope that answers this question, your question, to some extent, sir. Dr. Naresh.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Second, to Dr. Hemant's question about data availability. What kind of data you are talking of? If you could talk about that, whether it is in terms of missiles or it is in terms of deployment, or
any kind of, now what is the strength of Indian nuclear bombs, or where these things are deployed, or right, any kind of like how many people are engaged in manufacturing of this. Yeah, so various aspects of it. So what kind of data we have?
So there are a couple of groups across the world which are doing this kind of work, and many of them are relying from whatever they published on only open source information. And one set of data which comes up is from the International Atomic Energy Agency. There is something called the Red Book, which the IAEA has brings out every year, and that Red Book has information about how much mining, how much milling, what is the kind of SWU that enrichment facilities are working at. So this is information which is given by the countries on their own. Right, and to some extent, if one has been working on these issues and following these issues, you also know, okay, Pakistan now has built Kahuta 1, 2, 3, and this is the kind of capability which is there with Pakistan, and you can at least predict a range in the terms, okay, if Kahuta 1 came online in 2010, 2021, this is the kind of operating. If it operated for 365 days, it operated for 200 days, 250 days, this much of material will come out of it given the capacity of the Kahuta 1. Like that, you can make certain intelligent estimates. I am not saying that it will be the correct picture. No country is going to exactly tell us how much actually they have produced, how many bombs they have, but using some knowledge about this thing, using some publicly available Google Maps, you can bring out certain kind of intelligent ranges about production of fissile material. The second about missiles, what are the ranges of the missiles, that can be done through what is called open source imagery analysis. Because all these countries, whether it is India, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is China, all these countries, United States, everybody displays their missiles at some point or the other. Russia, and they have these parades. You have publics taking pictures of missiles when they are being transported. So DF-41, for instance, first time it was spotted by a Chinese who put it on took a photo of his on his smartphone and posted it online. So everybody across the world was happily looking at the missile, and they were seeing, okay, this is the kind of length it has, so many axles, this is possible the length and the range. So with that certain kind of stage, you can know, okay, this is a 3-stage missile. Through looking at the photograph, you can see that is a 3-stage missile. This is the kind of so many meters it is. So it can have this much of propellant. If you feed that into certain kind of softwares, you get this thing of what is the range, possible range that the missile can go. Like I showed Nuke Map, there is another website called Missile Map, which is also made by Alex Wallerstein, where you can put in certain ranges of any kind of missiles that you might have, and then you can launch it and see, okay, what is the kind of area that a 5,000 kilometer missile can cover from, say, India. What part of China will it cover? Will it cover all of China? Will Agni cover all of China, or Agni 5 will cover all parts of China? So those kind of studies are very much possible, essentially because of lot of these images being available, Google Map or Google Earth being available today. So these studies can be done or are being done. Thank you.
Arun, we have one more, Dindayan Beragi. Please go ahead, Dindayan, sir.
नमस्कार सर.
नमस्कार
सर, मैं पूछना चाह रहा था अरुण सर से कि एक अपने थिंकर्स हैं, अपने मिलिट्री साइंस के थिंकर्स है, उनका कहना है कि जो थर्ड वर्ल्ड वॉर होगा उसका तो मैं नहीं बोल सकता, पर जो फोर्थ वर्ल्ड होना है वो लकड़ी से और पत्थरों से ही होना है. तो सर इसमें जो इसकी भयावहता है न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स की, तो सर क्या बिल्कुल परफेक्ट हैं ये उनकी थॉट्स, उनका सोचना बिल्कुल सही है क्या कि अगर थर्ड वर्ल्ड वॉर होता है तो सही में सर पूरी दुनिया मतलब अगर न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स इसका यूज अगर इसमें हो जाएगा तो क्या सर खत्म हो सकती है, या जो भी इसके जो परिणाम होंगे वो बिल्कुल भयंकर हो सकते हैं मानवता के लिए, ये पूछना चाह रहा था।
थैंक यू बैरागी जी। मैं ये मानता हूँ कि जो आप बोल रहे हैं, ये जो थिंकर बोल रहे हैं वो बहुत सही बोल रहे हैं, बिकॉज आज के डेट पे जैसे हमने ये वेपन्स देखे, मतलब 5,000 इधर, 800 इधर और 6,300 वेपन्स इधर, ये खुद ही यूएस और रशिया के पास अभी कम होने के बावजूद इतने वेपन्स है कि पूरे विश्व को वो 3-4 बार डिस्ट्रॉय कर सकते हैं। तो उस वजह से ये तो बहुत सही है, और इसी वजह से हम यही चाहते हैं कि जो मैंने इफेक्ट्स ऑफ न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स और इनके बारे में बोला, उसका ये एक मेरा एक मोटिव था कि हम लोग स्टूडेंट्स को भी और सबके लिए भी ये एक जानकारी रहे। मिलिट्री साइंस आप पढ़ाते हैं, डिफेंस स्टडीज, हम लोगों को ये मालूम है, बट दूसरे डिसिप्लिन्स के जो टीचर्स होंगे या जो फेसबुक पे स्टूडेंट्स देख रहे हैं, उनको भी ये मालूम होना चाहिए कि ये कितने एक भयंकर किस्म के वेपन्स हैं, परमाणु हथियार कितने ज़्यादा डिस्ट्रक्टिव है। और वो एक जब जो ये इंफॉर्मेशन ज़्यादा लोगों के पास पहुंचता है, तब मैं मानता हूं कि ये इसका जो लेजिटिमेसी है या इसका जो जो प्रेस्टीज इसमें ज़्यादा कि सबके पास न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स होने चाहिए, ऐसे हम मानते हैं, काफ़ी कंट्रीज मानते हैं, वो कम होता जाएगा। मतलब ये एक प्रोसेस है और ये ज़रूरी है कि हम इसको समझें कि ये कितने एक डिफरेंट किस्म के वेपन्स है और हथियार है और उसका क्या डैमेज पोटेंशियल है।
हो सकता है।
थैंक यू
सर।
थैंक यू।
Thank you, Arun. We are almost running out of the time. Before we are closing, I just there is a request from our participants. If possible, they want you to share your PPT with them. That is a request. You are mute.
I will do that. I will.
Okay. So thank you so much once again. For such a wonderful lecture. As I said earlier, also it's very interesting and we have so many things to learn. And I believe our participants have already benefited, as I said earlier also. And in a way that it is a kind of an information to our participants also, some way we also realize the way you saw about the new map. It can just, even anybody can just try and understand, how destructive these weapons are, and it goes to the very last questions. So thank you so much, and thank you once more.
Thank you.
And we will close here for this session. Okay. Mayur, live बंद कर दीजिए. So Arun, you have some announcement for tomorrow?